The machine had been sitting at the edge of his east field for 14 months before anyone made a decision about it. Not because the decision was complicated, because nobody wanted to be the one to make it. The Massey Ferguson 6S165 had been repossessed from a farmer named Curtis Albright in the spring of 2 years prior, driven to the field boundary by a dealer employee who had run out of road before he ran out of trouble, and left there when the tractor seized completely on the way to the transport truck. The hydraulic system had been failing for months before the repossession. The previous owner had known it and said nothing. The dealer employee had not known it until the machine stopped moving 40 yards inside the field boundary of the adjacent property, which belonged to a 69-year-old retired grain farmer named Harold Ennis, and refused to move further. The dealer employee had called his manager. The manager had called the dealership. The dealership had called a transport company. The transport company had sent a truck that couldn't reach the machine without crossing Harold's property, which Harold had not given permission to cross, because nobody had asked Harold anything. Harold had stood at the fence line that afternoon and watched a dealer employee, a transport driver, and eventually the dealership's service manager stand around a seized Massey Ferguson on the edge of his east field and argue about whose problem it was. Harold had not offered an opinion. He had gone inside when it got dark, and in the morning the machine was still there and the men were gone. That was how it started. Harold Ennis had farmed 1,800 acres of corn and soybeans in Fountain County, Indiana, for 38 years. He had retired 3 years earlier, leasing his ground to a neighbor's operation and keeping his equipment shed, his shop tools, and the 40 acres around the farmhouse for his own use. He was not a man who looked for complications in his retirement. He had a wood stove in the shop, a decent set of hand tools, and a standing Wednesday morning coffee arrangement with 2 men he had known since 1979. He had not planned, at 69, to get into the Massey Ferguson parts business. The legal situation took 7 months to resolve. The dealership held the security interest in the repossessed machine. The machine sat on Harold's property without his consent. The path to recovering it crossed his land without an easement. Harold had not blocked recovery. He had simply declined to grant access until someone asked him properly and agreed to repair the ruts a recovery vehicle would create crossing his east field. The dealership's attorney sent a letter. Harold's attorney responded. A negotiation that should have taken 2 weeks took 7 months because the dealership changed ownership during that period. The new owner reviewed the situation, concluded the machine's recovery cost exceeded its salvage value in its current condition, and quietly decided to let the legal situation drift rather than spend money on a machine they had not bought. By the time title resolved, through a process Harold's attorney navigated with the county and the lien holder with more patience than anyone involved deserved, 14 months had passed. The machine had sat through 1 full winter, 1 spring thaw, 1 summer, and into the following autumn. The hydraulic failure had been compounded by weather. An electrical fault had developed. The cab had taken on moisture. 1 rear tire had gone flat from a sidewall crack opened by frost. When the title transferred to Harold Ennis, the dealership's formal position was that the machine was being conveyed as is, with no warranty, representation, or expectation of operability. The dealership had written the machine to zero on its books. It was, in every financial sense the dealership could apply, worthless. Harold walked out to the east field on the morning after the title transfer was confirmed and stood beside the Massey Ferguson 6S.165 for a long time. He was not a Massey Ferguson man by history. He had run Case IH equipment for most of his farming years, switching to a mixed fleet in his last decade of active operation. He knew Massey Ferguson equipment the way any experienced farmer knows competing brands, well enough to operate them, not deeply enough to rebuild them from the inside. What he knew, standing at the edge of his east field on a cold October morning, was that the machine had not become worthless because it was a bad machine. It had become worthless in the dealership's accounting because the cost of making it whole exceeded what the dealership could recover at retail. That was a dealer's calculation. It was not the only calculation available. Harold had a heated shop. He had 40 years of mechanical experience on agricultural equipment, not specialized in Massey Ferguson, but thorough in the ways that matter across brands, for a man who had spent 4 decades keeping machinery running in conditions that do not forgive ignorance. He had time. He had no particular deadline. And he had a piece of equipment that had cost him nothing, sitting 14 months in his east field, waiting for someone to decide what it was actually worth. He called his neighbor with a tractor and a chain, and they pulled the machine to his shop. Harold did not begin with optimism or with a plan. He began with an inspection, the methodical kind that requires no optimism and generates no plan until the inspection is complete. He went through the machine system by system over 3 days, documenting what he found in a spiral notebook on the shop workbench. The hydraulic pump was beyond rebuild, internal scoring too severe, clearances too far gone. The hydraulic system itself, lines and cylinders and valves, was intact and serviceable once the pump was replaced. The electrical fault was a corroded main harness connector behind the instrument panel, a repair requiring patience and a crimping tool, not a new harness. The cab moisture damage had reached the headliner and one door seal, but had not compromised the structural elements or the glass. The engine, which he pulled the valve cover on to examine, was cleaner than he had any right to expect. The previous owner, whatever his faults and disclosure, had kept the engine serviced. Harold sat with his notebook that evening and added up what he was looking at. The hydraulic pump was the critical cost. He called a supplier in Indianapolis he had used for Case IH parts, described the application, and was quoted $840 for a rebuilt unit. He called 2 more suppliers. The range was $650 to $2,100. The electrical repair was his own labor and $40 in materials. The cab work was foam seal and time. The tire was $380 mounted. He ordered the pump from the Indianapolis supplier on a Thursday. It arrived the following Tuesday. He had the old pump off and the new one mounted and bled by Thursday afternoon. He started the engine Friday morning. The hydraulics came up correctly. He drove the machine out of the shop, engaged the rear linkage, watched it rise and lower cleanly. Then he drove it back into the shop and sat in the cab with the engine running, and thought about what he was going to do with a fully operational Massey Ferguson 6S165 that had cost him $2,280 in parts and 3 weeks of his own time. He had not advertised the machine's presence on his property. He had not told anyone outside his family that the title had transferred. But in Fountain County, information about equipment moves through the agricultural community, the way water moves through tile drainage, without announcement, through channels below the visible surface, arriving at its destination without anyone being able to say exactly how it got there. 3 farmers called Harold in the 2 weeks after he had the machine running, asking if it was for sale. He told all 3 he hadn't decided yet. One of them, a farmer named Pete Sollers, who ran a mixed operation north of Attica, asked what Harold wanted for a hydraulic pump replacement on his own MF6S. The machine was showing early signs of pump failure, and Pete would rather pay Harold to source and install the replacement than deal with the dealer in Covington, who had quoted $3,200 for the pump and $600 for the installation with a 3-week parts wait. Harold told Pete to bring the machine over on Saturday. He sourced the pump from the same Indianapolis supplier at $1,650. He installed it in 4 hours. He charged Pete $650 part and $200 for the installation. Pete's alternative had been $3,800 in 3 weeks. Pete was back 6 weeks later with a different machine and a different problem. Harold did not plan to become a Massey Ferguson shop. He noticed that he was becoming one. The observation he made across that first spring and summer was the same one that anyone paying attention to the agricultural equipment service landscape in rural Indiana would have made, had they been positioned to see it clearly. The regional Massey Ferguson dealer was 40 miles from the center of his county. Its labor rate was $115 per hour. Its scheduling ran 4 to 6 weeks out for non-emergency work. The farmers in Harold's area who ran Massey Ferguson equipment, and there were more of them than he had realized, were making a calculation every time something needed attention. Drive 40 miles, wait 4 to 6 weeks, pay $115 an hour, or find another way. Harold was another way. He was 15 minutes from most of the farms that called him. He charged for parts at his cost plus a margin he considered fair, and for his time at a rate that was less than half the dealer's labor rate and more than he would have made doing nothing. The farmers were not getting a discount. They were getting a different service structure, faster, closer, more direct, from a man who would tell them plainly what was wrong and what it would cost and whether it was worth fixing. By the end of the first full year, Harold had worked on machines from 22 farms. He kept a notebook of every job, machine, problem, parts used, cost, time. Not for billing purposes, but for the reason he had always kept notebooks, because a man who doesn't record what he learns forgets more than he should. The learning was accumulating faster than he expected. Massey Ferguson's 6S hydraulic pumps failed in a pattern he began to recognize. Hours, symptoms, the way pressure would fluctuate before failure became complete. MF7S electrical faults had a recurring location in the cab wiring that appeared across different machines from a similar production window. Certain hydraulic cylinder seals across multiple MF models shared a part number the dealer cataloged under only one of them, meaning sourcing the seal for a model where it wasn't cataloged required knowing the cross-reference, which the dealer's counterstaff didn't always have, and Harold had written in his notebook after the third time he'd worked it out himself. This kind of knowledge does not exist in a service manual. It exists in the accumulated observation of a man who has seen the same failure enough times to understand not just what failed, but why and when, and what the early signs were. Harold bought his first parts tractor in the second year, an MF5S with a destroyed engine and a sound everything else, purchased at an estate auction for $800. He parked it along the back fence and began pulling usable components as he needed them. He cataloged every component before he began pulling. What was present, what condition it was in, what it would cost new through his supplier, so that when a farmer called with a need, Harold could tell him within a few minutes whether he had the part and what he was asking for it. The parts tractor concept worked better than Harold had anticipated, for a reason he should have expected but hadn't fully accounted for at the start. The components he pulled from a retired machine were not just cheaper than new parts. They were tested. A hydraulic cylinder from a machine that had run 8,000 hours without that cylinder failing was a cylinder that had already proven itself in field conditions. A PTO shaft from a parts tractor was a shaft with a documented service life behind it, not an unknown sitting in a warehouse. Harold began to communicate this to farmers in the specific, plain way he communicated everything, and the farmers understood it the way experienced men understand arguments that match what they already know from experience. A part that has run is different from a part that hasn't. Not always better, but different in ways that matter when you're making a calculation about what to spend and what risk to carry. He bought a second parts tractor at the end of that year, then a third. His son came to visit in the spring of the third year and walked through the shop and the lot and the back fence line where 3 partial machines stood in various stages of being consumed. He asked Harold what the operation was making. Harold showed him the notebook. The son sat at the workbench for 20 minutes going through the numbers. He said the operation had gotten beyond what a spiral notebook could optimally manage. Harold said he was running it the way it needed to be run. The son said that was not an answer to the question he had asked. Harold's son built him a simple spreadsheet on a laptop Harold already owned and didn't use much. Harold migrated the notebook records into it over 2 weeks. What the spreadsheet showed, laid flat and totaled for the first time, was that the operation had generated $94,000 in its second full year from parts sales and repair labor. Harold looked at the number for a long time. He had not been tracking it in a way that made the total visible. He had known the work was steady and that the individual transactions were fair. He had not known the aggregate. The third year came in at $121,000, the fourth at $156,000. Harold hired Jim Castor in the fourth year, 63 years old, recently laid off from a crop input supplier that had consolidated its regional staff 30 years in agricultural supply and parts before the consolidation. Jim knew how to manage a parts inventory. He knew how to source components across multiple suppliers and find the price and availability combination that made the most sense for a specific situation. His knowledge complemented Harold's mechanical depth the way a good parts man complements a good mechanic. Not visible in the same way, not credited in the same way, but the reason the operation worked as well as it did. Jim worked 4 days a week. Harold paid him fairly. Jim told Harold 3 months in that he had not expected to enjoy working again after the layoff. Harold took that as the kind of compliment that means more than a formal performance review. The regional Massey Ferguson dealer, now under its third ownership in 6 years, became aware of Harold's operation in the 5th year through a customer who had mentioned Harold's name during a dealer service visit. The dealer principal called Harold the following week. The conversation was careful on both sides. The dealer principal asked whether Harold would be interested in an authorized service arrangement. Harold asked what that would require. The dealer principal described the training requirements, the tooling requirements, the parts procurement requirements, and the pricing structure an authorized independent shop would operate under. Harold listened to all of it. Then he said no. He said it without hostility. The pricing structure would require him to raise his labor rate to a level that eliminated the primary reason farmers drove past the authorized dealer to reach his shop. The parts procurement requirements would replace his supplier network with a single channel that would cost him more and limit his flexibility. The authorization would create obligations that would change what his operation was in ways that made it less useful to the people it currently served. The dealer principal said he understood. He asked whether the two operations could cooperate in specific situations without a formal arrangement. Harold referring customers for warranty work or major rebuilds beyond his shop's capacity, the dealer referring customers for older machine non-warranty work that the dealer's cost structure made uneconomical. Neither man committed to anything formal. Both men understood the conversation had been useful. What the dealer principal did not say, and what Harold understood without it being said, was that the conversation had happened because the dealer's Fountain County customer count had been declining for years in a way the ownership had finally looked at directly. Harold had not taken those customers. They had arrived at his lot because the service structure they needed did not exist at the dealer's price point. That was a market condition, not a competitive act. Harold had not advertised. He had not undercut the dealer's pricing in a way that required the dealer to respond. He had simply been available, competent, and honest about what things cost in a location that was convenient, at a rate that made sense for the scale of farms that couldn't justify a $115 per hour labor rate on equipment that was already paid for. The dealer's authorization structure, its overhead, its manufacturer requirements, its staffing model, all of it had created a gap. Harold had filled the gap. The dealer calling to discuss cooperation was the dealer acknowledging the gap without acknowledging it directly, which Harold considered a reasonable approach from a man in a difficult position. By the end of the 6th year, Harold's operation had generated cumulative revenue of just over $400,000. The number was not a goal he had set. It was what the work had returned when the work was done honestly and the parts were priced fairly, and the farmers who needed a different option found their way to a lot in Fountain County, where a retired grain farmer had made a decision about a seized tractor that a dealer had decided wasn't worth the cost of recovery. The Massey Ferguson 6S165 that had started everything was still running, still in Harold's lot, still working his fence lines and his gravel and his 40 acres. The hours had crossed 10,000. Harold had rebuilt the injection pump in the 5th year, 4 days, $340 in parts, done methodically with the service manual open on the bench and his own notes beside it, from the injection pump rebuilds he had done on customer machines in the years since. The engine had not otherwise been opened. The hydraulic system he had repaired in the first week continued to function without issue. Farmers who came to the lot saw the machine working and asked about it. Harold told them the story without embellishment. The dealer had determined it was worthless. Harold had made a different determination. The difference between those two determinations had been $2,280 in parts and 3 weeks of his own time. The machine had been working for 6 years since then. The farmers who heard the story did not find it surprising. They had their own versions of it, machines written off by people who were calculating at dealer rates rather than at the rates available to a man with a heated shop and 40 years of mechanical knowledge and nothing more pressing to do. The notebooks filled the shelf above the workbench. 11 of them now, dense with the accumulated knowledge of a man who had spent more time inside Massey Ferguson equipment than he had ever expected to, and had come to understand it in the way you understand something that you have given serious and sustained attention without any expectation that it would matter beyond the immediate problem in front of you. It had mattered well beyond that. A machine that a dealer had decided was worthless had arrived at the edge of Harold's East Field because a hydraulic system had failed at an inconvenient location and nobody had been willing to spend the money to recover it. Harold had spent $2,280 to make it run. In doing that work, he had positioned himself, without design, without a plan, at the intersection of a knowledge gap and a service gap that existed across several counties of agricultural land in central Indiana. He had filled that gap the way water fills a low place, not by planning to go there, but because the conditions made it the natural direction. Out in the lot, in its usual spot, the Massey Ferguson 6S165 sat ready for whatever Harold needed it to do next. Engine original, hydraulics sound. A machine that had been decided worthless by people calculating at the wrong rates, and decided worth fixing by a man who knew the difference between what something costs to restore and what it is worth when it runs. The dealer had left it in the field because the math hadn't worked out. Harold had done different math. For 6 years, the machine had been proving him right. The tractor appeared on a Tuesday morning in April of 1995, and nobody told her it was coming. Margaret Howell was 43 years old. She farmed 80 acres outside Covington, Indiana, corn and soybeans on ground that had been in her family since 1961, inherited from her father, worked carefully through the difficult years of the 1980s, and held onto with the specific determination of a woman who had decided that the land was the thing that mattered and that everything else was negotiable in service of keeping it. She was in her south field checking soil moisture when she heard the truck. By the time she walked back to the lane, the flatbed was already leaving. On her gravel lot, sitting at the edge of the grass where her drive met the field, was a Massey Ferguson 2680 she had never seen before. She stood in the lane looking at it. There was a paper under the windshield wiper. She pulled it out. It was a repo notice from First Consolidated Bank of Fountain County, documenting the seizure of the machine from a borrower named Gerald Tate, whose farm 6 miles north had gone into foreclosure in February. At the bottom, handwritten in ballpoint, transport delayed. Machine held at above address pending retrieval. Contact branch for pickup scheduling. Margaret read it twice. She looked at the tractor. She looked at the lane, empty now, the flatbed long gone. She went inside and called First Consolidated Bank of Fountain County. The woman who answered connected her to the loans department. The loans department connected her to someone in asset recovery. The person in asset recovery said they had a note on the machine and that transport had been delayed due to a scheduling conflict and that someone would be in contact within 2 to 3 weeks to arrange pickup. Margaret said, "It's sitting in my lot." The asset recovery person said, "Yes, ma'am, we have the address on file." Margaret said, "I'd like to know when it's being moved." The asset recovery person said, 2 to 3 weeks. Someone will call. Nobody called in 2 weeks. Margaret called back. The asset recovery department said the transport had been rescheduled and that someone would be in contact shortly. Shortly turned into another 3 weeks. Margaret called a third time. This time the person she reached said the machine had been flagged for an internal review of its assessed value before transport decisions were finalized. He said it might be another month. Margaret said, "It's been 6 weeks." The person said, I understand. Someone will be in contact. Nobody was in contact for another 6 weeks. By July of 1995, the Massey Ferguson 2680 had been sitting in Margaret Howell's gravel lot for 3 months. She had called the bank 4 times. Each call produced a new timeline. Each timeline passed without contact. In August, she called a different number, the branch manager directly. She explained the situation. The branch manager was apologetic and said he would look into it personally and get back to her within a week. He did not get back to her within a week. He got back to her in October, 6 months after the machine had arrived, with a letter stating that First Consolidated Bank of Fountain County had reviewed the asset and determined that the cost of transport and storage exceeded the machine's assessed liquidation value, and that the bank was therefore releasing its interest in the asset. The machine was hers. Margaret read the letter at her kitchen table. Then she walked out to the lot and stood in front of the Massey Ferguson 2680 that a bank had seized, hauled to her property, forgotten about for 6 months, and then decided was not worth retrieving. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went back inside and got her toolbox. The Massey Ferguson 2680 was a 1982 model. It had been in Gerald Tate's operation for 9 years. Gerald had been a capable farmer before the financial pressures of the late 1980s had accumulated into the kind of crisis that foreclosure represents. Not a single catastrophic decision, but the slow compound effect of commodity prices that didn't recover and input costs that didn't fall, and a credit structure that had been built on assumptions that the market revised without notice. The machine showed 9 years of hard use. The hour meter read 11,200. The cab had a cracked window on the right side, sealed with silicone that had dried and shrunk and no longer sealed. The seat was split along the back seam. One hydraulic hose was weeping at a fitting, had been weeping for a while based on the dried residue on the frame below it. The front left tire was low, not flat, but down enough that the tractor leaned slightly in that direction when viewed straight on. The engine turned over when Margaret tried the key. It fired on the fourth crank, ran rough for a minute, and then found an idle that was uneven but present. Blue smoke from the exhaust on startup, clearing as it warmed. Not good, but not catastrophic, rings showing wear, not failure. The hydraulics moved when she tested them, slowly, the weeping hose losing enough fluid that she could see the level dropping in the reservoir sight glass during a 2-minute test. She shut it down and made a list. This was how Margaret approached problems, with a list, ordered by priority, each item assessed for what it required and what that requirement cost. The list for the 2680 had 7 items. None of them were impossible. 3 of them she could address herself. The remaining 4 required parts she could source. She spent the winter of 1995 on it. She fixed the hydraulic hose first because fluid loss was the most immediate threat to the machine's usability. She replaced the tire. She addressed the cab window with a proper seal rather than the failed silicone. She ordered piston rings, the source of the blue smoke, from a parts supplier in Indianapolis and installed them over 2 weekends in November, a job she had not done before on this engine configuration but had done on similar ones and had the service manual for and completed correctly. By March of 1996, the Massey Ferguson 2680 started cleanly, idled smoothly, and moved hydraulic implements without losing fluid. Margaret drove it out of her lot and across her south field on a Saturday morning in early spring, and felt the 4-wheel drive engage in a soft corner and pull without spinning, and understood, in the concrete way that a farmer understands a machine by what it does under load, that she had something worth having. She had paid nothing for it. The bank had paid to transport it to her lot, and had then decided that was already more than it was worth. The bank was wrong. Margaret knew this. She had known it since October when the letter arrived and she walked to the lot and stood in front of the machine. She had known it because she could read a diesel engine and read a hydraulic system and read a parts catalog. And what those things told her was that the 2680 was worth the work it would take to make it right. The bank's asset recovery department could not read any of those things. It could only read the assessed liquidation value, which was a number produced by people who had never started the engine. The 2680 changed what Margaret could do on her 80 acres. Before it, she had been working with a single two-wheel drive tractor that was adequate for her ground in dry conditions and inadequate in the wet springs that Fountain County delivered with some regularity. The 2680's four-wheel drive gave her traction in conditions that had previously cost her planting days. Planting days in April in Indiana are not abstract. They are the specific windows between rain events when the soil is workable, and the farmer who can use more of them plants earlier. And the farmer who plants earlier in corn and soybeans has a yield advantage that compounds from emergence through maturity to harvest. In 1996, Margaret planted 5 days earlier than she had in any of the previous 4 years. Her corn yield that fall was 14 bushels per acre above her previous 5-year average. The improvement was not entirely attributable to planting date. She had also adjusted her fertility program that year, but the planting date contribution was real, and she knew it, and she noted it in her farm journal, where she tracked such things. At the elevator that fall, a farmer named Bud Carver, who farmed 300 acres to her east, asked what she'd done differently. Margaret said she'd added four-wheel drive. Bud said he'd seen the tractor in her lot. When did she get it? Margaret told him the story. Bud listened to the whole thing and said, "The bank just gave it to you?" Margaret said, "They left it here and eventually decided they didn't want it back." Bud said, "And you fixed it up?" Margaret said, "It needed fixing." Bud said, "What did it need?" Margaret told him. Bud was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've got a 3090 with a hydraulic pump that's going and I can't get the dealer to come out for 2 weeks. You know those pumps?" Margaret said, "Come by Saturday." Bud came by Saturday. Margaret pulled the hydraulic pump from the 3090, inspected it, determined that the internal gear set was worn beyond service limits, and sourced a rebuilt pump from her parts supplier in Indianapolis for $280. She installed it on Sunday. The tractor worked on Monday. Bud paid her $350, parts plus labor, at a rate that Margaret set based on what the job had actually taken her, not what the dealership would have charged. Bud told 2 farmers. Those farmers called. By the spring of 1997, Margaret was doing repair work for 6 farms in the county. By the fall, it was 11. She had not advertised. She had not planned to be in the repair business. She had been in her lot fixing a tractor that a bank had abandoned, and a neighbor had seen it and asked for help, and she had helped, because the help was available, and the need was real, and the work was something she could do. The distinction between planning something and doing it because you can, and the need exists, is not always meaningful in retrospect. But Margaret understood it. She had not sat at her kitchen table in 1995 and decided to build a repair business. She had decided to fix a tractor. Everything after that had followed from the tractor. By 2001, Margaret Howell's repair operation had grown beyond what she had intended it to be when she answered Bud Carver's question about hydraulic pumps. She had 22 regular customers across 4 counties. She had sourced a second parts tractor, a Massey Ferguson 3070 with a cracked block, and a third, and had built a parts inventory that covered the most common failure modes of the models she worked on most frequently. She had hired a part-time helper, a retired mechanic named Dave Stinson, who had worked at a KIH dealer for 17 years, and who brought to her shed the kind of experience that covers the territory between what a service manual says and what a machine actually does when it is old and has been used hard. Dave worked 2 days a week. He cost Margaret $40 an hour, which she paid without dispute, because Dave's 2 days produced work that would have taken her 4, and the rate was what the work was worth. She raised it to 45 in 2003 when Dave mentioned that a shop in Attica had offered him 3 days a week at the same rate. Margaret said, "I'll give you 45 in 3 days." Dave said that worked. He stayed. The repair revenue in 2001 was $68,000. In 2003, it was $94,000. The growth was not driven by advertising. Margaret had never placed an advertisement, but by the specific word of mouth that travels through farming communities when someone is doing work correctly at a price that reflects what the work actually costs. A farmer who brought a machine to Margaret's shed received an honest diagnosis, a realistic estimate, and a repaired machine that worked the way it was supposed to work. That combination was not universal in the repair business in Fountain County, and its absence elsewhere made its presence at Margaret's shed memorable in the way that correct things are memorable in environments where correct things are not guaranteed. In 2004, First Consolidated Bank of Fountain County was acquired by a regional banking group based in Lafayette. The acquisition produced, among other things, a portfolio review of the acquired bank's historical asset management decisions. The review identified several instances of abandoned assets in the 1993 to 1997 period: machines, equipment, and in 2 cases vehicles that had been repossessed and then left at holding addresses when transport cost exceeded assessed liquidation value. The portfolio reviewer who found Margaret's case noted it in his report as a resolved matter. The asset had been formally released, the documentation was in order, no further action was required. He did not call Margaret. He did not know that the machine he had found in the historical file was sitting in her shed with 16,000 hours on it, having been rebuilt once since the bank released it and used every season for 9 years. He did not know about the repair business. He did not know about the 22 regular customers, or the parts inventory, or Dave Stinson's 2 now 3 days per week. He knew the assessed liquidation value from 1995, which had been $1,200. He did not know what the machine had become worth to the person the bank had accidentally given it to. The repair business crossed $200,000 in annual revenue in 2007. Margaret hired a second part-time mechanic that year, a younger man named Scott, who had grown up on a farm in Warren County and had the specific practical education that farm-raised mechanics carry, the kind that produces people who can read a machine's problem from its sound and its behavior before they open anything. She had expanded the shed by then, a 30-foot addition on the north end, poured concrete floor, 2 additional vehicle lifts, wiring for a second welding station. The addition cost $41,000, paid from operating revenue without financing. Margaret had not borrowed money for the business at any point in its existence. She had grown it from what it produced, which meant it grew at the rate the work could sustain and not faster, which meant she never had a payment schedule that required the business to perform at a level the market might not support. In 2008, when credit tightened and farm operations that had been financing equipment upgrades found their lines reduced, Margaret's business grew. The farmers who could no longer afford new machines needed their old ones kept running. The farmers who had been sending work to dealerships because the dealer was convenient now found that convenience had become expensive in a year when expense was the thing they were most focused on avoiding. Margaret's shed was honest and thorough and priced at what the work cost, and she was 18 miles from most of her customers, which was 18 miles closer than the nearest dealer that offered comparable service quality. By 2009, her revenue was $240,000. She called First Consolidated, now absorbed into its parent group, in the spring of 2009, not for any specific reason, but because she had been thinking about the letter from 1995 and wanted to see if anyone at the bank remembered the machine. She was connected through 3 departments before reaching someone in the Legacy Assets group who said he could look up the file, but that it would take a few days. He called back and confirmed the record, the asset release, the documentation, the $1,200 assessed liquidation value. He asked if there was a problem. Margaret said there was no problem. She said she had been running the machine for 14 years and wanted to let them know it was still working. The man on the phone did not know what to do with that information. He said, "That's good to hear." Margaret said she thought so too. She thanked him and hung up. Margaret Howell is 61 years old now. The repair business she built from a tractor the bank forgot to collect runs at $380,000 in annual revenue. She has 3 mechanics. Dave Stinson retired in 2014, the year he turned 72, and was replaced by two younger men whom Margaret trained the way she had trained herself, through the service manual and the parts catalog and the patient repetition of doing difficult work until difficult work becomes familiar. She still farms her 80 acres. The Massey Ferguson 2680 that the bank released in 1995 was retired in 2011 at 19,000 hours. The engine had been rebuilt once in 2004, which added 9 years to its working life, and replaced with a used Massey Ferguson 5465 that Margaret bought at an estate sale in Park County for $11,000 and had running correctly within 2 weeks. The repair shed she operates is not the one the bank's flatbed driver passed when he left the 2680 in her lot in April of 1995. That shed was adequate for one tractor and a toolbox. The current shed is the expanded version, concrete block, 2 vehicle lifts, welding stations, parts inventory that covers the most common failure modes of every Massey Ferguson model produced between 1975 and 2010. On one wall of the shed, framed, is the letter from First Consolidated Bank of Fountain County, dated October 1995, stating that the bank was releasing its interest in the Massey Ferguson 2680 and that the machine was hers. Bud Carver's son, who took over his father's farm in 2008, is one of Margaret's regular customers. He brings his equipment to her shed on schedule, twice a year for inspections, anytime something needs attention between inspections. He told her once that his father had talked about the hydraulic pump repair in 1996 until the year he died, not because it was remarkable, but because it had been the beginning of something he'd watched build across 20 years and had come to think of as one of the things that worked correctly in his county when many things didn't. Margaret said she appreciated hearing that. The young mechanic who came to her shed last spring, wanting to learn, 24 years old, just out of a technical program in Lafayette, reminded her of no one she could name specifically. But she hired him anyway, at the rate the work was worth, and started him on the service manual the way Dave Stinson had started on it in 2001, from the beginning, because the beginning is where correct knowledge starts, and there is no shortcut to it that holds up under pressure. She started him on the 2680. The machine was retired from field work, but Margaret had kept it in the shed as a teaching machine. Every system accessible, every component documented, the full history of what had been done to it since April of 1995 recorded in the maintenance log she had kept since the day she first turned the key. The young mechanic asked where the tractor had come from. Margaret told him. The bank seizure, the 6 months of phone calls, the letter, the toolbox. He said, "They just gave it to you?" Margaret said, "They forgot they had it." "I didn't forget." He asked, "And everything you built came from that?" Margaret looked around the shed, the lifts, the welding stations, the parts inventory. The 3 mechanics who came in every morning and knew what they were doing and did it correctly. The $380,000 in annual revenue that a bank's asset recovery department had set in motion in 1995 when a flatbed driver left a tractor in a gravel lot and drove away. She said, "It came from the work. The tractor was just the beginning." He nodded. He opened the service manual. He started reading. Outside, the April fields were ready. The machines in the lot were fueled and greased and waiting for the season. The work was the same work it had always been. Careful, repetitive, honest, patient. The kind of work that does not announce itself. The kind that simply continues, season after season, until it has become something that nobody who saw the beginning could have predicted from that beginning. A bank had left a tractor in a gravel lot and driven away. Margaret Howell had picked up her toolbox. 14 years and $380,000 later, the toolbox was still in her hand.